Let it go, make my body go, make our bodies higher and higher.
One of Excel's most powerful features is called a macro. A macro is a way to automate your work. Let's start with a simple idea. Here's a worksheet called HR Lists. It's in the file called 15-macros. From time to time, you flag certain cells here. You're an HR manager. You've got some other people who work for you who will do the editing and adjustment of these. And you highlight a cell and you make it yellow maybe. Maybe add a red font. And admittedly, maybe this is overkill. You make it bold, you make it italic. You might even want to add a border. That's 5 or 6 steps. I wasn't really counting. For whatever reason you like that, you'd like to use it again down here. Well, we could copy the format, but you might want to use it tomorrow or the next day or at different times. Wouldn't it be great if we could simply click somewhere, press a keystroke shortcut, have this happen all over again? Now, admittedly, a small series of actions. But the idea behind a macro is you've identified a sequence of steps. You'd like those to be faster. Now, ultimately, a macro isn't just about short sequences. It can be about a sequence that might involve 20 steps or 40 steps. And it certainly could involve major commands. Consider in this worksheet, for example, different people need to see this at different times. And 3 or 4 times a week, maybe, you go through the process of updating this list, maybe sorting it by status, saving a copy of that, maybe printing, maybe not, sending it to a few other people, and then immediately thereafter that, perhaps you run a filter to expose only the hourly names, and you print that or save that, send it to somebody else, and so on. You might have identified a 25-step sequence. Now, after doing that for a few weeks or so, you say to yourself, if I take exactly the same steps, there ought to be a way to say, let's do this all at once. In Excel, the macro concept begins, first of all, with the idea that you've identified a sequence of steps that you would like to automate. If we could press a keystroke shortcut and have all that sorting and filtering and printing and saving be done within a few seconds, that's going to save us some real time. Instead of 10 or 15 minutes 3 or 4 times a week, how about a few seconds? In Excel, macros are typically created after you've identified the sequence. You turn on a feature called a macro recorder. You go through the actual steps, all those are being stored and saved, and then at a later time, you can press a keystroke shortcut, or maybe by way of a new button up in the quick access toolbar, you'll press that button, cause the macro to happen, maybe even an icon on the worksheet, a symbol, an icon, a picture even. Here's a different worksheet here called Pricing Sheet. It's a bit of a mess, but it's effective. It also reminds you that you open other worksheets from time to time. You're the worksheet troubleshooter, perhaps, in your organization. It sure would be handy if we could identify which cells have formulas. And you can. If on the Home tab, you go to the Find and Select button on the far right side, there's an option called Formulas. It highlights all the formula cells. If you're going to be working with a worksheet like this, it sure would be handy if we had color applied to these or some other visual feature. So after highlighting these cells, maybe go to the Home tab on the left side here, use the Fill Color bucket, apply a background color, possibly even a font or a border feature if you wanted to. If you find yourself performing these actions, this too could be turned into a macro. It's only 5 or 6 steps, but if you use it frequently, and particularly if you find it annoying, why not make it happen fast by way of that keystroke shortcut, possibly? As we look at certain buttons in the ribbon menu system, we might even begin to say, these are like little macros. Now, I can't imagine anybody using Excel who doesn't know what B means, but if you didn't know, you might go to Format Cells, maybe by way of right-click Format Cells, or you could press Control-1. If you wanted to make a cell be bold, you could go to the Font tab and click Bold and click OK. But who really does that? Instead of those 5 or 6 steps, why not use B? Maybe I want this to be bold. Click B. We don't call that a macro, but in a certain sense it is. Here's another example, back on the HR list here. When someone leaves this organization, let's say we leave the name in place for a while, but we do make a visual change. We highlight the cells in question, and then we apply strike through. How do we get to that? That's by way of format cells. We could right-click and choose format cells, Control 1, or this button up in the menu system, font right here, the dialog box launcher. Click that. In any of those three ways, we'll come to format cells. We might or might not see the font tab, but if we do, we can apply strike through. Click OK. Now, a bit later, we might find out there's a keystroke shortcut for strike through. Highlight these cells, press Control 5. That removes strike through or it applies it. Now, we don't call these macros, but in a certain sense they are. We're taking a single action instead of multiple actions. And ultimately, macros, a really powerful tool, can be sophisticated, and they might encompass maybe 50 steps, 100 steps. It's all about the idea. We want a series of actions to be essentially turned into one action. It doesn't mean that whatever the actions are going to be instantaneous, although in some of the short macros I've suggested they will be practically. At certain times, some macros might take 2 or 3 minutes, particularly if they involve a lot of manipulation of data. But the key idea is you've identified certain actions that you perform frequently, you'd like to automate them. That's what we're going to be doing by way of macros. After identifying the steps that you would like to record and turn into a macro, it's time to begin that process. We've got the file open, 15-macros. We're on the HR list. Let's imagine we want to record a macro that applies a particular set of formatting features. Click a cell. It's your job to indicate which of these cells needs to have some editing done to them, and you simply want to apply a format. We'll go to the Home tab here, click the drop arrow for the fill color bucket, maybe choose an orange-like color there, maybe a different color font too. Now admittedly, what I'm doing is a bit of overkill. I'm applying multiple features. I'll apply bold, italic, maybe one of the border features out here, the thick box border, or maybe one of the others, maybe that one. That's probably enough for now. For whatever reason, I like that. That's the set of steps that I want to use. I want to use it frequently. Sure, I could copy the format, but I want it available all the time. So, what do? Let's turn on the feature called a macro recorder. Now, before I do that, look in the lower left-hand corner. We see the word ready. If you right-click in the status bar at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a ton of different checks here. Here's one for macro recording. It's not necessary to select this, but if you do, and I just did, down in the status bar now, we see a little icon. If you are about to record some macros, it's kind of handy to see that there to remind you, as we slide over it, no macros are currently recording. Click to begin recording a new macro. So we could use that button. It's not necessary to have it though. You've identified the steps, you've written them down, or you remember them, you'd like to start recording a macro. Now as we record the macro, we will be formatting a certain cell, but it makes no difference which one. Suppose you're about to highlight Diane Andrews over here. Maybe that's a misspelling of her name, or there's some other aspect of that. Maybe there's a middle initial we forgot. You're simply flagging it for attention later, and you like those formatting features. So let's start the process of recording a macro. If that button is present in the lower left corner, we can click that. If not, we can go to the View tab in the ribbon. The far right button is called Macros. It's got a drop arrow below it. Click it, and Record Macro. This opens the Record Macro dialog box. The macro name can be quite long. It cannot begin with a number. It cannot contain spaces. Ideally, you describe what the macro does. In this case, how about highlight cells? Something like that. We can use the underscore character. No spaces, though. I might use underscore here, or simply shift into uppercase. Either way. Underscore or both, maybe. Highlight cells. We can use a keystroke shortcut. It's not required. There's a tendency to use these frequently as you're getting started. Over time, what might happen, you record another, always using keystroke shortcuts. You're trying to use meaningful letters maybe, you run out of those. And furthermore, maybe eventually you'll just have so many, you kind of forget which one is which. So, let's use one. And what can we use here? Only letters. We've got 52 choices. Any of the lowercase letters, any of the uppercase letters. If you use lowercase letters, you might be on the way to inhibiting one of the other Excel features. For example, if the key word in my mind right now is cells, and I put in C right now, the letter C, as I'm using Excel, every time I press Control C, it's not going to mean copy, it's going to activate or make this macro happen. I don't want that to be the case. I could use Shift C, as far as I know. That's not in use by Excel, but even if it were, if I didn't know what the shortcut meant, it wouldn't mean that much anyway. If, for example, I simply use H here, now that does mean replace, but if I never use Control H for replace, this is okay. There is a tendency to use the Shift key, and that's what I'm going to do here. I'm holding down the Shift key right now, pressing H. So that's going to be the keystroke shortcut. Later we might change this or get rid of it, or if we didn't apply it here, apply it later. When you record a macro, you should also be thinking, and you probably should have thought ahead of time also, is this macro likely to be used only in this workbook? And sometimes that's going to be the case, particularly if it's manipulating data in a certain way. Store the macro in this workbook. If not, you will want to store the macro in Personal Macro Workbook. I always think this should be called Global Macro Workbook. A macro stored here is available to all workbooks as you work with Excel. It's also important to note that when you store a macro in Personal Macro Workbook, that location is on the current computer. We'll talk more about this later. For now, let's say we only want this macro to be used in this workbook. At a later time, we might decide to use this elsewhere. We can copy and paste it into another workbook or into the Personal Macro Workbook. A description, certainly not required, but in longer macros, really helpful. Short macros, you might just copy this, Control-C, paste it down here. That's a bit redundant. We don't worry about that just now, but maybe take more time in this cell or on a cell, something like that, or maybe even describe it if you wish. In longer macros, it's important, particularly if you're opening a macro that somebody else has written and you see a description there. It's going to help you understand. Not critical just yet. Before I click OK, a reminder. When I do click OK, we are in record mode. And that means that every action that I take will be recorded. And later, when we try and use this macro, and by the way, we sometimes say run the macro, play back the macro, execute the macro. Those all mean the same thing. The steps that I take in here will happen again. That means if I scroll up and down during the process of recording, that's going to be in the macro. Sometimes it'll be innocuous, we won't see it, but you want to stay focused while recording. So I'm going to click OK. Look in the lower left corner. To the right of the word ready is a box. Slide over it. A macro is currently recording. So we could come down here later to stop recording. Or we could go back to the View tab and the Macros button. So we're in record mode right now. We can put the active cell anywhere. It's on the Diane Andrews cell right now. That's fine. Let's go through those actions again. Home tab. Remember, we're recording right now. If this button retains the color that we want, we'll just click it for fill color. Same thing with the font. Or we click the drop arrow and make another choice. We want it to be blue, that tan or orange background. We want that border like this. We want it to be bold. We want it to be italic. Again, we're sort of overplaying this, but still. This is what we want. And every time in the future, when we click on a cell and use that keystroke shortcut, we want this look to appear. So we're done recording. We can go down to the lower left corner or back to the View tab, the drop arrow for macros, stop recording. The macro has been recorded. Let's try it over here. Control-Shift-H. Well, it looks like it works. Does it work on 2 cells? Forgot to try that. Let's see. Highlight this. Control-Shift-H. Looks like it does. So it's available to us indefinitely until we possibly get rid of that or make changes to it. This is always available in this workbook. Now, when you close the workbook, of course, you'd want to save it to make sure that happens too. So we've got a macro available. Keep in mind too, there are other macros we might be recording. The process will be the same. We've identified the sequence of steps. Maybe on this workbook here, we want a macro that always highlights the formula cells. That's the kind of macro that we might be using elsewhere too. So we've identified what we wanted to do, and in our example here, admittedly small, it's a 6 or 7 step sequence, but from now on, at any time in this workbook, anytime we want to highlight cells in a certain way, we can simply press Control-Shift-H. Now, it's also important to note that you can't undo a macro. In other words, I can go back here. Undo is not selectable. Now, if I happen to click on a cell here, go to the Home tab and make it bold, and then I run the macro over here, Control-Shift-H, I change my mind. Notice that in the Quick Access toolbar, the undo capability is not available. And that previous action that I took here, I can't undo either. Now, admittedly, these are small actions. On the other hand, we can undo this by copying the format from another cell. In other words, if the macro is taking actions that apply formats, although we can't literally say undo and have the macro turn that cell back into the way it was, we can take other steps to make sure that that format is no longer there. But be thinking about this idea. If you create a macro that deletes data, and then after you try the macro or run the macro on certain cells, you can't then say, well, I'll undo this and get my data back. No, you cannot. In situations like that, you might have to close your file without saving it and then reopen it. So be wary of and stay away from macros that delete data. Sure, after a while, as you get more comfortable with this concept, if you become that kind of a person who uses macros frequently, you'll understand that concept and be very careful with it. But you cannot undo a macro. Again, what we did here was simply applying formats. You can easily apply other formats to get rid of them. So I've seen an example here of how to record a macro that applies a special set of formatting tools to a given cell or a group of cells. We're looking at the worksheet pricing sheet. It's in our file 15-macros. It's a strange worksheet in that we cannot figure out what's going on very easily. We've already identified the need to locate the cells that have formulas. And that's pretty easy. From the Home tab, far right button, Find and Select, choose Formulas. That's also a feature that we might use in other worksheets as well. In fact, maybe we're the person in the organization that people turn to help them figure out what a file is all about, what a worksheet's all about. We've become the worksheet guru, maybe. That's a handy feature. And it's short enough to say, I don't mind doing it manually. But on the other hand, we could turn that into a macro. Now, there's a companion feature that's going to take a few more steps, but it's pretty valuable too. We might want to highlight just the cells that have pure numbers in them. And we can do that by first clicking on a single cell, going to the Find and Select button again on the Home tab, and you wouldn't have known about this feature without trying a few options here. It's under Go to Special. Now, if we choose constants, it will highlight constant cells, meaning cells that do not have formulas in them. And it's at first a little bit strange too. The Formulas button applies to these boxes below, but so does the Constants button. If we just want to highlight those cells that contain constants that are numbers, we'll uncheck these boxes here. Click OK, and it will highlight those cells. And we might want to apply a color to these as well. So that's quite a few steps, and we would get tired of performing those single actions if we need this frequently. And furthermore, as I had suggested earlier, if we want this feature to be available all the time, in other words, if we'd like to have a macro that does these things all the time, we can do that. Let's create a macro and execute it a few times, not only here, but maybe in other worksheets and ultimately in other workbooks as well. Sometimes when we record macros, we're thinking of this idea. We can use this in a lot of different situations and in different files. So we've identified a need. Let's go to the View tab in the ribbon and click the arrow under Macros. Record macro. Now remember, we don't go here unless we have identified the steps we want to record, and that could have meant writing them down or remembering them. Record macro. As always, there's a temporary macro name here. Let's give it a better name. Highlight _ number cells. If we wanted to, we could go further with a longer description and indicate that these are not formulas. For now, number cells. Keystroke shortcut we'll use here. How about Control-Shift-N? Key thought in our mind might be the letter N. Hold down the Shift key, press the letter N. And then, if we have time, we'll put in a description. However, store macro in. We've identified this macro, this potential macro, as something we want to have available all the time. Click the drop arrow, choose Personal Macro Workbook. If this is the first time that we are recording a macro on this computer in Personal Macro Workbook, we are in effect creating this workbook. This workbook will have the name Personal, and its file extension will be XLSB. Think binary, although we don't have to go into discussion on that. XLSB. Personal is the name of the file. It will be stored on this computer. If we click OK, record the macro, save our workbook, and then as we exit from Excel, there will be a prompt to save the Personal Macro Workbook. We will do that. That means from there on into the future, every time we open Excel, this Personal Macro Workbook will be available. If we've already recorded a single macro here, at least one macro, now if we press OK, we're simply on the path to adding another macro into the Personal Macro Workbook. It's also important to stress here that if we did choose this workbook, and then later we thought, could we put that into the Personal Macro Workbook? The answer is yes. You can copy and paste macros from one workbook into another. It's relatively easy. It's just like copying and pasting text in Microsoft Word. We've decided we'd like to be able to use this macro with other workbooks as well on this computer. We've chosen Personal Macro Workbook. Click OK. All right, we're in record mode. We've decided we want to be able to highlight the number cells. Go to the Home tab in the ribbon, rightmost button, Find and Select. Go to Special. These are the steps we took moments ago. We choose Constants. We uncheck the box for text, logicals, and errors. Click OK. We've highlighted the cells that have numbers. And let's say that every time we do this, we want to apply a background color. If we already have a macro that does this for formulas, maybe it's yellow, we'll be sure to pick a different color here. And if we do it, it's got to be a light color so that we can see the numbers through it. We're almost finished. In fact, we could be finished. Recognize these cells are highlighted and they are selected. I'm going to click in cell A1. The colors will stay, but those cells will not be selected for the moment. In other words, every time we run the macro, we want the cells to be highlighted, the color applied, and then simply jump to cell A1. Now remember, we're in record mode, and the action that I just took there of clicking on cell A1 is in the macro. We're done recording. We can click the box in the lower left corner. Stop recording. We've got another worksheet here, sales and profits. Let's go over there. Where are the numbers in here? I click here, I see that's a formula. So's that. Looks like a lot of them are. This one isn't. Active cell is anywhere in here. Makes no difference. Let's run this macro. Control-Shift-N. It highlights only the cells that have numbers. So this is a worksheet that's just loaded with formulas. If we had a macro for highlighting formula cells, these cells over here and all of these and 2 clusters below, these would all be highlighted in yellow if that's what the macro did. So we've got this macro, it's available all the time. Now, you might see the undo button up there. Can we undo this? If I press this button right here to undo, it's coming back here to do something. What's happening on sales and profits? We cannot undo this. And as we pointed out in the previous movie, you can't undo what a macro does, although if what the macro actually performed was something about applying format, we could certainly manually take off this format. But again, be very sensitive to the idea about undoing what a macro does. You can't really do that, although in some cases, like we suggested here, we can override that concept simply by applying a different format. We might also want to have this available by way of a button in the Quick Access toolbar. In fact, if we start recording more and more macros, we either run out of meaningful keystrokes or we might forget which one is which. Keep in mind, at any time, if you forget what the macro keystroke is, or if you want to change it, you can go back to the View tab, the drop arrow for macros, choose View Macros. It'll show all of our macros here, in this case only one. We can go to Options. If we need to apply a keystroke shortcut that we forgot to apply first and now we want one, this is where we come. If we want to change this from N to a different letter, fine, or we can get rid of it too if we wish. We can make changes here. I'm not making any changes, I'll just do a cancel. If we forgot the keystroke shortcut, we can also come to this dialog box. If I click Run, we're running the macro again. The cells are still highlighted, so we wouldn't see anything right now, but this is our fallback method for running a macro. And by the way, when we say run a macro, it's the same as saying play back the macro. So the word playback, the word run, sometimes you'll hear the word execute, sometimes you'll hear the word activate. They all mean the same thing. Let's make the macro do what it's supposed to do. Run is frequently used. We'll just close this for now. And let me manually take this off because we want to test this macro again by way of a quick access toolbar button. So all we need to do is highlight this data, and on the home tab, we'll remove that color background. Fill color button right here, no fill. All right, active cells anywhere. Let's go to the quick access toolbar and right click it. Right click anywhere in the quick access toolbar and then choose customize quick access toolbar. And down the left hand side, you'll see some choices here. There's a panel up top, choose commands from. Click the drop arrow and choose macros. Now you might or might not see some system files here. I'm only seeing one. Here's the one. That's the macro I just recorded. Clicking add means add this to the quick access toolbar. There are currently 3 buttons in the quick access toolbar. Now there's about to be a 4th one right here. If you don't like the icon to the left of it, you can choose modify, and you've got 181 choices. And it's highly unlikely that any one of these would convey what we're trying to do here. Maybe there's one in there with a number on it, something like that, but again, sometimes it's just a button. Maybe a green button here. Good enough for now. Display name is here. You can certainly leave this as you wish, or maybe just edit this to make it display what you want. So you can delete, add characters. It doesn't have to match the actual name of the macro, although it probably should be fairly close, or maybe slightly longer to describe it. Highlight number cells in this worksheet, something like that, or good enough the way it is. Click OK. And then OK, and we've got that button. Now, that button's going to be there all the time, even when other workbooks are open, and it takes up a little bit of space, but let's say you put it there because you need frequent access to it. We don't need to know the shortcut now. We're in any worksheet, say this one, we'll click that button. What happens? It highlights the number cells. We could go back here to the pricing sheet, click anywhere we want. Where are those number cells? There's that button. Let's click it. Remember, if we forgot the keystroke shortcut or if we didn't have the quick access toolbar, we would have to go to the View tab, choose the arrow underneath macros, go to View Macros. We only have one macro now, but if we had many, we'd select the appropriate one and click Run, and that would do the same thing. And there are other ways too. If a macro is for this workbook only, and it could be, and this one isn't, but still, we can run a macro also from a button. And we can get to those in multiple ways too. I'm going to the Insert tab in the ribbon. There's a Shapes icon here. We can pick any of these. Smiley face, pick a pentagon, hexagon. Maybe I'll use a rounded rectangle. Makes no difference. Create one of these. Right click. At first you might not see the appropriate choices. Right click again. You're likely to see Assign Macro. So, the only macro we have for now, this one, click OK. I could have put text in there. I still can. I can say click here to highlight number cells. Wasn't truly necessary, but that's okay. And all the other things you might be familiar with from the Home tab. Jumping back over there, make it bold, center it, top, bottom, left, right, that sort of thing. Fine. Click outside of it. It's now available. Let me manually take off the colors here. Highlight the cells this way. Fill color bucket. Most recent use was to choose no fill, so we'll apply that here. Try this. Click here to highlight number cells. It does that. Unlikely we would have a button for the kind of action we just saw here, but imagine in certain other kinds of worksheets, or maybe we sort, and we've got 3 or 4 different sort macros that sort the data differently. We'd have different buttons to the right to do this. And you could also do this with a picture too. Insert pictures, good online pictures. Maybe we'll type in a car. Now we're stretching this a little bit, but you get the idea. If it's appropriate, I can't really suggest this is a strong feature here, but if you have an icon, and it's a huge one here, we could shrink this, and like any other object or shape here, this too could represent a macro. Right click, there it is, Assign Macro. So maybe a little far-fetched there, but here too. Take these cells here, no background, click over here, run this macro. Same idea. So we've seen different ways to run macros. More important than this idea of the icons here, though, is the central idea of creating a macro that's going to be available all the time. If we close this workbook, we would save it. But more important, when we exit from Excel, there will be a prompt saying, do you want to save the changes you've made to the personal macro workbook? And you must say yes if you want this macro to be available in the future. For more information on how to work with macros, check out some of the other macros courses available at lynda.com.